The federal courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as people adjusted in their seats, phones silenced, eyes forward. Cameramen from major networks locked in their angles, knowing today's hearing could erupt into history. The air was thick with tension, charged with anticipation. At the front of the room, Justice John Roberts sat behind his elevated bench, wearing the traditional black robe with an expression as cold and measured as the gavel before him. He reviewed the paperwork with methodical slowness, as if weighing not just the law, but the impact of what he was about to say. Jasmine Crockett, known for her fiery speeches in Congress, stood calm and collected at the defendant's table. Her lawyers leaned in for one last whispered exchange, but she gently waved them off. Her posture was one of complete composure. Dressed in a bold, royal blue suit, she held her hands clasped in front of her, radiating both confidence and defiance. Every eye in the room flicked between her and the Chief Justice. The bailiff called the court to order, and the murmurs ceased instantly. Roberts looked up. "Ms. Crockett," he began, his voice firm, echoing through the chamber. "You've challenged the decorum and integrity of this court through repeated defiance. As such, I am imposing a fine of $200,000, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled across the room. A few reporters even dropped their pens. Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed, steady, almost unnervingly serene. Roberts paused, perhaps expecting outrage, maybe even protest. Instead, he was met with silence, calm, unwavering silence. He blinked. The tension had shifted. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for what would come next. Even the marble walls seemed to be listening. Jasmine Crockett slowly stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor like a measured drumbeat in a war of words yet to begin. The silence in the room deepened as she reached the center, turned to face the bench, and drew a deep, steadying breath. Her expression wasn't one of defiance, it was deeper, more complex. It carried the weight of generations, the strength of battles fought not with fists, but with resolve. She looked up at Chief Justice Roberts with eyes that held no malice, only truth. Then, she spoke, softly at first. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I stand here not as a criminal, but as a public servant. Not as someone who disrespects the law, but as someone who respects it enough to challenge its misuse." The courtroom remained frozen, transfixed. Reporters didn't write, they just listened. She continued, her voice growing stronger, deeper, filled with a kind of honesty that shook the space more than any shouted protest could. "You may have the power to fine me, to label me disruptive, but you do not have the power to silence what I represent." A flicker of discomfort passed across Robert's face. Jasmine took one step closer. "My constituents sent me to fight, to speak truth, to challenge systems that have favored the comfortable while punishing the bold." Her hands were no longer at her sides. One lifted slightly, as if she was not just defending herself, but standing up for every voice that had ever been dismissed, diminished, or disregarded. "I was elected to make noise," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not to make peace with injustice. So if the cost of speaking truth in this room is $200,000, then so be it." The words landed like thunder, not loud, but undeniable. The room held its breath. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause inside the courtroom. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Jasmine Crockett's words still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, visible, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Even the creak of the wooden benches beneath the spectators had ceased. All eyes were locked on Chief Justice Roberts, who sat still, his usually impassive face now clouded with something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The silence that followed her final sentence was not empty. It was filled with weight, with reverberations, with truth that echoed louder than a gavel ever could. Jasmine remained still, hands at her sides once again, her head held high. She wasn't waiting for applause or acknowledgement. She had spoken her truth. Whether or not it was received no longer mattered. Roberts shifted in his chair. A slight tremble betrayed him, barely noticeable to most, but unmistakable to the trained eyes watching closely. His fingers reached for his glasses, removing them with care, placing them down on the bench as though they suddenly felt too heavy to wear. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now searched the courtroom without focus. His gaze eventually returned to Jasmine, but it lacked the sternness from earlier. It was softer now, almost reflective. The judge who had once seemed immovable now looked moved. A quiet sniffle broke the silence. It came not from the defendant's table or the press section, but from a young court clerk sitting just behind the judge. She quickly covered her mouth, her eyes glossy with tears. Others began to shift uncomfortably, not out of awkwardness, but because they too felt the magnitude of what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't just delivered a rebuttal. She had delivered a reckoning. Roberts leaned slightly forward, his lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. He cleared his throat, but even that sound seemed subdued. The very walls of the room seemed to lean in closer, as if architecture itself recognized the gravity of the moment. Chief Justice Roberts sat in stillness, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his shoulders slowly rising with a heavy breath he didn't try to hide. Every camera lens was focused on him now, but he wasn't posturing for the press. He wasn't performing. He was reckoning, with himself, with the system, and with the woman who now stood before him like a mirror to all he had tried to ignore. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his microphone, clicked it on, and leaned in. His voice, when it finally came, was stripped of its earlier authority. It wasn't weakened, it was humanized. "Ms. Crockett," he began, pausing, searching for words he hadn't rehearsed. "I've sat in this chair for many years, presided over cases that shook the foundations of this nation, but today feels different." Gasps were stifled. No one had expected this, not from him. Jasmine remained still, watching him, her expression unreadable. Roberts continued, "When I read the fine aloud earlier, I did so under the letter of law. But what you just delivered was the spirit of justice." He blinked rapidly, his composure cracking ever so slightly. "I can't ignore what I've just heard. And more importantly, I can't pretend that it didn't move me." Another pause, this one longer. He turned to the court reporter. "Strike the fine from the record." Audible gasps filled the chamber, but Roberts raised his hand gently, not to silence the crowd, but to steady himself. "Let it be known that this court recognizes not only Ms. Crockett's right to speak, but the power of what she said." A murmur ran through the room, not of disbelief, but of awe. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, respectfully. The moment wasn't about triumph, it was about truth. Roberts looked down, eyes glistening, as if what he had just admitted had cost him something deeply personal. And maybe it had, but in that vulnerability, in that breaking of the judicial mask, something more profound was restored: dignity, humility, and perhaps a new understanding of justice. The courtroom doors swung open slowly, and the sound of applause poured in before Jasmine even stepped through them. Outside, a sea of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Truth over power, stand with Jasmine," and "Justice has a voice." News vans lined the courthouse steps. Microphones extended like antennas, desperate to catch her first words after the historic courtroom moment. But Jasmine didn't rush. She emerged with the same composure she had carried inside, measured, thoughtful, unshaken. The sunlight hit her face, and in that glow, she didn't look like a politician or a defendant. She looked like a symbol. The crowd erupted the moment they saw her. Reporters shouted questions, flashes flickered, and yet Jasmine lifted her hand, not to wave, but to quiet the storm. The crowd gradually hushed. She stepped to the cluster of microphones, her voice as steady as it had been inside. "What happened today wasn't about me," she said. "It was about what justice looks like when we stop fearing uncomfortable truths. When we listen." Her words rolled through the plaza like thunder wrapped in calm. Online, her courtroom speech had already been clipped, edited, and shared millions of times. Comment sections overflowed with phrases like, "Gave me chills, the most powerful moment I've ever seen," and "She didn't just speak, she woke the system." Inside studios across the nation, pundits pivoted. Networks that had once labeled her as too radical now ran glowing headlines: "Jasmine Crockett redefines civic courage, tears on the bench, a turning point in U.S. judicial history." Even longtime critics paused to reflect. Students in classrooms watched her speech as part of civic lessons. Celebrities tweeted in solidarity. A movement had ignited, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Jasmine Crockett walked down the courthouse steps, not as someone who had defeated a judge, but as someone who reminded the world what strength with grace looked like. And the world, it was watching, listening, and finally, understanding.